did those women see on that first Easter? Did it convince them of Christ's resurrection? And how does what we see influence what we believe? And how does what we believe influence what we see? These are the questions that keep me up at night. How do we look at life and death in the Easter story? And what might tell us that the resurrection happened? One of my favorite writers and preachers is Barbara Brown Taylor. Barbara Brown Taylor, and she writes about one of her first experiences as a child and seeing deep truths when she would go for walks in the woods. She writes this: "When I was a girl, I spent a lot of time in the woods, which were full of treasures for me. At night, I would line them up on my bed. Fat flakes of mica, buckeyes bigger than shooter marbles, blue jay feathers, bird bones, and, if I was lucky, a cicada shell. One of those dry bug bodies you can find on tree trunks when the 17-year locusts come up out of the ground. I liked them for two reasons," she writes. "First, because they are horrible looking, with their huge empty eye sockets, their 6 sharp little claws. By hanging them on my sweater, or better yet, putting them in my hair, I could usually get the prettier, more popular girls at school to run screaming away from me, which somehow evened the score. But I also liked them because they were evidence that a miracle had occurred. They looked dead, but they were not. They were just shells, each one of them with a neat little slit down its back where the living creature inside it had escaped, pulling new legs, new eyes, new wings out of that brown body and taking flight. At night, I could hear them singing their high song in the trees. If you had asked them, I'll bet none of them could have told you where they had left their old clothes." She continues by saying, "And that's all the women and the disciples saw when they got to the tomb that first morning. 2 piles of old clothes." Seeing as evidence of a miracle. Our family was living in New Jersey in 2017 when the next cycle of cicadas came to life. For this Orange County native, this was unbelievable. Thousands and thousands of cicadas on the tree trunks, on the ground, everywhere in town. Singing, they were ugly. They were loud, and they were amazing. Seeing and believing, seeing and being amazed. The resurrection is the one and only event in Jesus' life that was entirely between him and God. No one was there. No one saw anything. No one on earth saw what happened inside that tomb. They all arrived after the fact. Some saw clothes, women saw and heard angels. Most of them saw nothing because they were still in bed. It had been an exhausting week of fear and death, and they thought it was over. But they also realized later that the empty tomb itself wasn't really the point of the resurrection. Maybe resurrection is what happens after Easter morning. I continue to think about this intersection of seeing and believing and understanding, how they're all part of this ancient Easter story. But something in us wants to see something, to believe it. Or we might see something that causes us to doubt what we already believe. There are some sights that ought to make a believer out of almost anybody. There are stories throughout the Bible that people see something, and it brings them to faith and a sense of God's presence. Moses saw a burning bush that didn't burn up. He knew God was present. The parting of the Red Sea that allows the Israelites to escape the Egyptians. Jesus calmed the waters in the storm. Many stories in the Bible point people to that what they are seeing gives them confidence of God's presence and power. So of all the sights in Scripture, you would assume that might give birth to belief, an empty tomb should be at the top of the list. At the first light, the women came, their hands full of burial spices, the hems of their cloaks wet with morning dew, their hearts heavy with sadness and sorrow and loss. They get there and the stone is rolled away. The stone should have been in front of the opening. It had been sealed with wax. They knew where it was going to be. But they had come to bring spices to the outside of the tomb, but there it was off to the side. Shocking. How did it get there? I imagine driving south on 101, and suddenly Mount Tam is on the left instead of the right. How did it get there? Shocking. But according to Luke, the events of the first morning did not bring immediate belief. Not that rolled away stone, not that empty tomb. What the women saw caused them confusion. When the two men in dazzling apparel appear, the women move from being confused to being terrified. The text says they fell to their knees in fear. The divine beings remind the women what Jesus said. Luke says nothing about their reactions to the angelic messengers, only that they remembered. They saw the empty tomb with new eyes, Easter eyes. And then they tried to tell the others. In some ways, resurrection is about vision. What do we see? There's so much evidence of what we see in the world that tells us not to have hope, even on Easter. It really feels like we should stick with Good Friday eyes. Good Friday eyes that see Jesus was crucified by people who did not believe his words, did not believe he was the one who came in to usher in the kingdom, the reign of God, did not embrace his way of love and reconciliation and welcome and a bigger and bigger table to eat with the Samaritans and the lepers and the women and the children. They didn't want that. So he was killed on the cross, dead and placed in the tomb. His followers saw it with their own eyes. There's no reason to be optimistic. It was over. We understand the disciples on that first Easter. I think we would probably think the same. Today we see realities of violence and hate and death and greed and ecological disaster. Racism and hate and a resurgence of white supremacy are wreaking havoc in our communities and our country. The recent burning of 3 historic black churches is only one recent event and evidence that makes us sick to our stomachs. Seeing the world through Good Friday eyes is really the only logical choice. And Good Friday eyes aren't all bad. You can get by with them. Good Friday eyes are capable of limited vision. The women who came to the tomb that first Easter, they had Good Friday eyes. Jesus is dead. We're going to scoop up the burial spices. We're going to get the Kleenex. We're going to grieve. We're ready. But it wasn't what God had in store. Easter is about transformation and seeing with new eyes. Sometimes I read something that gives me hope and reminds me that people are seeing with Easter eyes, and that moves them to small acts of compassion and love. More than 20 years ago, I came across a book entitled Morning Glory Babies. It is the story of the Star Cross community, a small, independent, ecumenical community of lay people located in Sonoma County. One of their primary ministries was and is to care for children who are born with HIV or AIDS, to care for those babies. And it started in the 80s. They started this ministry. The author writes, from the media perspective, death is the essence of the story about our children. A typical headline from the newspaper about us reads, "A moment of sunshine in the shadow of death." A television producer was working on a story about the arrival of a baby girl named Melissa. He asked if his network could have an exclusive on the end of the story. The Easter-eyed founder of the community writes of his frustration. For me, the story is that Melissa is beginning to walk, and she sings a duet with David in only a language that babies understand. It all depends on the eyes through which you are looking. And sometimes the eyes of love don't see straight, they see a broader vision. The ones who came to the tomb loved Jesus. They just couldn't see him for all of who he was. Bringer of new life, giver of grace, liberator, one who faces down evil and death, one who offers a promise of resurrection. They didn't see it all, but then they got a glimpse, and they told others, and they could see. But it's so hard to hold on to Easter eyes. We've got trumpets and flutes and music and flowers today, but tomorrow, it's going to be hard to hold on to Easter eyes. We'd rather cling to Good Friday eyes. How can we awaken to Easter in a time when we need it more than ever? as leaders willfully imprison refugees, kill reporters, deny the clear signs of climate change for short-term profit, and see themselves as infallible despite their clear moral limitations. We face challenges in our own lives. People will be diagnosed with cancer, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. People will hurt each other with words and fists. Addictions to alcohol and drugs will bring chaos and harm to the lives of people we love, including ourselves. Dreams and plans will not come true. It is so tempting to go back to Good Friday eyes. It seems like the only logical choice. And yet there is something in us that senses something beyond Good Friday, especially today. And what we can see, and what is logical, there's more. But what if resurrection and seeing with Easter eyes isn't just this event in the past that we remember today? It is something ongoing. It is something real that God is doing in the world. I think the church is the living body of Christ and witness, ongoing witness to the resurrection, as imperfect as churches are. We gather, and other churches gather, because God raised Jesus from the dead, whatever that means, that mystery. And it reminds us that resurrection maybe isn't just a personal experience to believe or know. My sermon title comes from a poem by Guatemalan poet Julia Esquivel, entitled, "They Have Threatened Us with Resurrection." The context for this poem was the murder and repression of peasants in Guatemala from the 1950s through the 1980s. Her poem, written in 1980, suggests that both the oppressors and those being killed, the martyrs, threaten us with resurrection. She had an interesting perspective, and I had to read it a few times, but her sense was those who were doing the killing were trying to convince the people there was no hope. There will never be a good life. There will never be resurrection. And those who had been killed and martyred, she sensed their presence with her, calling all people still there, fighting and hoping that there was resurrection. But it wasn't one person, it was a collective call to the collective group. Resurrection happens in community. She wrote, "Join us in this vigil and you will know what it is to dream. Then you will know how marvelous it is to live threatened with resurrection, to dream awake, to keep watch asleep, to live while dying, and to know ourselves already resurrected." What threatens us with resurrection? Are we afraid to believe it, to see with Easter eyes? I think the church at its best continues to be a community of the new creation in a world that seems riddled with violence and death and destruction. The church is about the business of praying for renewal of the world and seeking to renew it. Resurrection in community. One of the people who helped me see that most clearly was Jean. Jean was a member of a church that my husband Jeffrey and I started in the Pocono Mountains of Pennsylvania. We were called to start a new church from scratch. We had choir rehearsal in our house, Bible study at the ice cream parlor, and we worshiped at the middle school. So when people said, "And where's your church?" It took a long time to explain it. Jean started coming to worship. And one year we invited people to write their own resurrection stories. And Jean wrote something that has stuck with me, and she's given me permission to share it. Jean wrote in 2005, "My son Christopher was 17 and full of life. Some people called him a gentle giant. He was tall and sweet. He was a senior at Pocono Mountain High School and enjoying his classes at Monroe County Votech. On April 7th, 2000, he was riding in a car with 3 of his friends near Route 423 in Tobyhanna. The driver was going too fast. The car spun around and hit a tree. Christopher was killed instantly. My husband John and I spent the next years trying to cope with the overwhelming grief of losing our son. I know Christopher is in the loving arms of God, but I missed him so much. I found grief support groups and they helped, but the hole in my heart was so deep and dark. 2 years ago, I found myself walking into worship at New Life Presbyterian Church at the middle school. I know God brought me there. That day was the beginning of a resurrection for me. I found I could begin to believe again that life was not over for me, that God would give me strength and peace each day. I found friends here that I could talk with, laugh with, and even cry with. God gave me hope. God showed me I could help other people facing the death of someone they loved through our grief support ministry. I began going to the women's study group and learning the meaning of Bible stories for the first time. God showed me that my love for children and teenagers could be used in our Reach After School program, making snacks, reading with children, playing games. I am coming back to life. Christopher's birthday was on Good Friday last week. He would have been 22, she wrote. God helps me face each day. On this Easter Sunday, I thank God for all of you who have helped me experience resurrection. Who might help us see with Easter eyes? How might we sense God's hope in life, in death, and life beyond death? I want to close with one of my favorite stories. I read that Winston Churchill, years before he died, planned his memorial service, his funeral. He knew it was going to be in St. Paul's Cathedral. He included many of the great hymns of the church. He used eloquent Anglican liturgy. At his direction, a bugler, high in the dome of St. Paul's, played this after the benediction. Taps. The day is over. Life has ended. But then, Churchill had one more instruction. as his instructions indicated, another bugler, placed on the other side of the great dome, played this. Revelry! Get up, get up! It's time to get up! That's the note Churchill wanted to end his funeral with, and what he believed about the end of history. It would not end with taps. It would end with revelry. God brings joy and resurrection and hope. He knew it and he said it with music. So we need to get up. We are not dead. Like the cicadas, we have escaped from our shells and we are alive. Look with Easter eyes. May we live each ordinary moment as people who know the promise of resurrection and new life. Amen.